I'm Nick with the USS Hornet Sea Air and Space Museum, and today we are not on the ship at Pier 3, but we're at Pier 2, where another famous USS Hornet used to be docked.
April 2nd, 1942, the USS Hornet CV-8 left Alameda Naval Air Station on her way to launch the famous DooLittle Raid.
And they didn't call it that. It was kept in a special file in the White House in a secure room called the map room. And that map room was adjoining the Oval Office. And it was in that they had this one file called Special Aviation Project Number 1. And that was the title. Later on, it's called the DooLittle Raid. That's how it all came together. Everything here and over there was water. All of that was water. They landed, taxied across that taxiway, came over here, and the Hornet was parked on the other side of that pier. Interestingly, there's only one picture of them boarding the planes on the Hornet. It was taken in the air by one of the other crews who had come this way, or were coming over this direction, and they reached across and took a picture. The only picture in existence. And according to Doolittle's after-action report, he said he had 465 feet for takeoff. So I've measured that from the front of the ship. This is 465 feet. It's right at the back of the island. What was amazing about the mission is that they went. They were supposed to get within 500 miles of Tokyo before they were going to launch. Because the ship was discovered by some Japanese picket ships, they launched earlier, 200 miles earlier. By launching at 500 miles, they were going to just make China. Now they're launching 200 miles too soon, and based on that knowledge, they weren't going to make China. Yet the men got in the planes and left. That was what was courageous. I spent a lot of time, I became very close to two of the members on that raid. On the number 8 airplane, the plane that left right behind Ted Lawson. The youngest man on the raid was on that plane. His name was David Pohl. David Pohl was a tail gunner. Interesting, when you talk to him afterwards, they always talk about everybody, other people were, I shouldn't say everybody, but other people were trying to beg these guys, can I go on the mission? I'll do anything, pay. And you talk to David, and he said, how did you feel about it? He said, I didn't want to go. Kind of goes contrary to what you always hear. He said, no, I didn't want to go. I said, well, why did you go? He said, peer pressure. Dave told me another thing. He said on the morning that they did launch, he was going to be launching later that evening because Doolittle was going to be the first, go to Tokyo, drop flares, and that would be the way the other pilots would be able to identify where Tokyo was. So he said he just went down to have breakfast, came up on the flight deck to walk around, and all of a sudden he saw shells coming from the right side of the ship, starboard, across the flight deck. He kind of was startled, looking on what's all the activity about. And shortly after that, they got the call, all Army pilots, man your aircraft. And they said then it went crazy. Everybody started running around. They started trying to get the engines warmed up, turning propellers, people climbing into the aircraft. Interesting, funny story. This is neat because it's been confirmed with some other people. When they boarded the ship, one of the members of the crew was a doctor, a medical doctor, white. And he had, in order to be on the mission, he had to serve in one of the spots on some crew. They couldn't just bring him along because he was a doctor. So he qualified as a gunner. One of the things Doc White did, though, before they boarded the ship, he made sure he thought everybody should have a bottle of, I don't know whether it was whiskey or bourbon, something. So he came aboard there was 80 people on the mission. He had 80 bottles of bourbons, little pints. When he boarded the ship, Navy says you can't have those. That's against Navy regulations. He said, well, they're going with the planes. They're not just going to drink them here. He said, no. We'll store them for you. When the day you leave, we'll give them back to you. Navy ship. He's in the Army. He's got to go with the Navy, right? On that morning, when they're boarding the planes, Doc White runs through the planes and hands out 5 of those to each airplane for the crew members. David Pohl was saying he was thinking about this. They'd launched. He was en route to Japan and wondering. He said, I didn't know if I was ever going to see my family again. And I'm supposed to have this bottle to drink when I get to the other end. I may never get. What the heck? He opened it up and went to drink it. It was tea. The Navy had drained all the whiskey out and they kept it for themselves. Later confirmed too with the commanding officer of this airplane said when he got to Russia, because it's one plane that lands in Russia. In total, they lost nothing, where the other planes lost everything, equipment, cameras, and all. They landed with all those bottles, and Ski York was his name. Ski York said when he got to Russia, he said, well, I guess better try it. Opened it up, went to drink it, it was tea. So great story. I remember the first plane launched about 7:20 in the morning, and they launched all 16 within about an hour. And then Halsey, who's on the Enterprise, the adjoining ship, turns the fleet around and they sail due east. He wants to get out of the areas. It's been said by some people that he went directly to Pearl Harbor. No, he at least for 24 hours, I've read the deck logs, he went due east. He just kept going. The more I've read into this, looked into this, you find out that after the war, when everybody was trying to write the history, some of the key people who made those decisions, they couldn't remember. They were asking other people, what happened? So a lot of the things that you hear about when this all started is a lot of afterthought, and people are trying to find the bump in the road when it occurred. I maintain, when you look at the notes and follow what's going on, it sort of grew organically out of other things that were happening at the time. December 7th, Pearl Harbor was hit. On the 8th, the Secretary of War, we don't have that position anymore. His name was Henry Stimson. He's already got his staff looking at a way to hit Japan instantly. So you didn't have to tell him or say, hey, go do it. They knew. And what their problem was, they were trying to get B-24s that were being delivered to England. Because remember, we're the Lend-Lease. And they had a bunch of airplanes headed to England. The English needed them. Stimson, he's trying to figure out how can I get those from him to give to our guys so we can go out and hit the Japanese. It's in his diary. You read about it. So the first thing we got to do, we're trying to figure out how we can get those planes from the British. Things start going. Churchill, within 24 hours, 48 hours, has already contacted Roosevelt. He wants to come over and meet with him. And the reason he wants to meet with him is pretty obvious. The United States is now at war with Japan. Well, up to this point, all of our attention and resources have been to help England. He wants to make sure it keeps coming to us, and he knows that Roosevelt's going to have a tough sell when they got a war in the Pacific, and we're not at war with Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So he calls him and gets in touch with him right away. Before December 10th, this is important, he's convinced Roosevelt, well, he initially said, we got to find a place to go talk. And Roosevelt says, I can't go, we got this war going. I can't get over there until maybe after the first of the year. So finally, Churchill says, I'll come and see you. So they agreed, all before December 10th. And we know that because he got the paperwork where Roosevelt sent back to him and says, okay, you can come on over and we're expecting you. On December 11th, Hitler declares war on the United States. Unilaterally. That's how we get into war with Hitler. We weren't at war with Hitler. Okay? So Churchill shows up. This is where I'm going to show you how it grows. He shows up with his staff. Now the United States is at war with Germany because we didn't declare war. They declared war on us. We're at war with Germany as well as Japan. So now the Churchills arrived. Their planning is not only Japan, but really also Europe. In one of the first meetings they have after he arrives, 2 weeks after, in the White House, on January 4th, 1942, 2 weeks after he arrived, they're discussing the first invasion and operation of the United States Armed Forces in Europe. It's not even in Europe, it's going to be in North Africa. It's called Operation Torch. And one of the things that they got to do is they got to get airplanes over there. In that meeting, you have Admiral King, Chief of Staff for the Naval Operations, the top sailor. And you also have Marshall, top Army guy, with his assistant, Hap Arnold, in charge of the Air Force. And they're in the meetings trying to figure out how do we get airplanes there to protect the troops because there aren't runways. Interestingly, it's King, Chief of Naval Operations, who pops off and says, put him on a carrier, fly him off. Arnold, I've got his notes, his handwritten notes. Arnold gets really excited. His hand goes from small to huge letters. King just said we got to fly planes off carriers. It's never been done. We got to test it. No one talks about that. They go right past it. They both agree. The next morning, both King and Arnold sign a letter to tell the Air Force separate some airplanes, put them on a carrier, and go test it. This is January the 5th. 5 days later, January the 10th, one of the members of King's staff, his name is Francis Lowe, he has to go down to look at the brand new aircraft carrier that's already been commissioned and is about to be put out, called the Hornet, CV-8. While he was there, he happened to be waiting at the runway. It's not clear whether he was waiting for a takeoff or he was in the air, and he saw airplanes landing on a silhouette of a carrier. He gets the idea when he comes back to Washington that day. He goes to King's office. At the time, they were living, both King and a lot of his staff were living on a boat that was on the Potomac because the Pentagon's under construction and nobody wants to work in the munitions office. He knocks on the door and he approaches King. He says, I have something to tell you. And he tells him about his experience watching those planes land. And he says, why don't we just have Army planes go on a carrier and let's go and bomb Tokyo? King sits back. Everyone makes a point when they tell this story, including him. The King, who's usually abrupt, dismissive, and everything, sits back. He said, that's a good idea. Talk to Duncan. Why? Because he thought about it 5 days before. It was King's idea, trying to solve the problem. Suddenly he's connecting the 2 points. So he tells Lowell, who was a submariner, talk to Duncan, who was the Navy specialist for aviation. Have him look at it. Oh, and by the way, tell no one. Ends up 5 days later presenting a plan, 50-page handwritten report. He doesn't even type it. He doesn't trust anybody to see it. Presents a 50-page report on doing the mission. They present it to Arnold, who's the Army guy. He buys into it. He says, yeah, this is good. I'm going to check it with my guy. Who's this guy? Jimmy DooLittle. So DooLittle knew anything about this. Arnold knew about possibly taking airplanes because they had discussed it just a few days before. And that's how the thing comes together. It's organic. It just grows out of the result of meetings and things that are happening, comments that people make. Not this line on the sand that people draw and say, well, that's where it happened. No, it kind of grew out of what was going on all around them. That's how the DooLittle Raid started.
If you would like to hear more about this historic event, please join us on Saturday, April 22nd at 11 a.m. aboard the USS Hornet Sea, Air and Space Museum for an exclusive DooLittle speaker series with Steve. Thank you for watching this video, and please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more.